say that horror is about the return of the repressed, some concept or movement that has been held down by the ruling ideas of the day resurfaces with a vengeance. But every revealing is also a concealing, and every narrative participates in the construction and denial of what ideas are available. Whose voices get heard? Whose perspective is told? And what happens when the narrative gets the repressed ideas wrong? In this episode of Horror Joy, we continue our academic horror course by returning to Helena Marcos's dance school in Luca Guadagnino's 2018 reimagining of Suspiria. The bright reds and goblin soundtrack have been exchanged for the drab palette of post-war Berlin and Tom York's haunting melodies. Here, we are explicitly confronted by the political violence of the time, the strenuous and very breathy rigor of dance, and the desire for power, youth, and beauty pursued by the coven of witches hiding in the depths of the studio.
In this plot-driven version, Guadagnino provides a deliberate articulation of witchcraft, motherhood, and the myth of the goddess in an attempt to offer a feminist film about the empowerment of women. However, as Lindsay McCummer claims in her article, Radically Feminist or Monstrously Feminine, these films draw on some of the earliest misogynistic constructions of the myth to represent witches as inherently bodily, monstrous figures who threaten the patriarchal order and thus perpetuate the structures that leads to the policing of women's bodies beyond the screen. What is behind the guise of the Dance Academy? What does the film reveal about motherhood? And what's the deal with the Red Army faction and the German autumn that serves as the film's historical setting? So, grab your favorite meat hook as we bear witness to the haunting spell of the dance. Try your best to keep your breath and to avoid the basement, and the mirror dance room, and the mothers. Maybe stay away altogether. But remember, when you jump, it's not the height, but the space beneath you that matters. This is Horror Joy. We're your hosts. I'm Brian Onishi.
And I'm Jeff Stoyanoff. We're two professors seeking the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. All right, Ians, welcome back to another episode of Horror Joy. Today we are continuing our course on academic horror with a discussion of the 2018 remake of Suspiria, since we talked about the original Suspiria on our last episode. So obviously a lot of the plot and a lot of the story remains the same in the remake. Some things do change though significantly in ways that we are going to discuss with Jens today to figure out how academic horror is functioning here and what does this movie have to say about both academic horror, maybe about witchcraft, maybe about its inspiration of the original, potentially feminism, and definitely some breathy or breathy, I think is the word, dancing. So Brian, I'm going to punt it to you to start. I guess kicking off would be the football terminology, not punting. I'm going to kick off to you to see what, with academic horror here in 2018's Suspiria.
Yeah, maybe things are so bad that we have to punt, actually. Like, we just start the game with a punt. Like, everybody's so bad at this. Nobody's scoring any points, so let's just punt, because that's how things are going to go.
We are Steelers fans, so I mean, that's kind of what they should have been doing pretty much all season. They should have just started the game by punting, because that offense was pretty putrid. Anyway, back to the topic.
It's true. Yeah. If they could just punt, then maybe they could score. We're scoring on defense. How does that work in a podcast? I have no idea. Welcome to the show, folks. You're going to figure it out with us, and maybe that's the horror. But I think, yeah, so academic horror, I think we jumped in with Suspiria, and Suspiria is in the academy, right? It's a dance academy, and I think it fits. Because again, last time we talked a lot about how in the academy, in any school setting, you're going to get this regulation of bodies, regulation of ideas, regulation of all that kind of stuff. And we get that in the dance academy. I think what's funny about Suspiria in 1977, so Dario Argento's version, is that we don't get a lot of dancing. We do get a lot of Susie Bannion like sick in her bedroom, but there's not a lot of choreographed dancing. We definitely get that here in Guadagnino's version from 2018. And I want to jump into why that is, what we're doing, what Guadagnino's up to, and all that stuff. But I also have been thinking about, so if we imagine academic horror, there's lots of times in horror, at least my experience of horror, and you all can talk back to us, reach out on social media, on our Gmail, whatever it is, tell us what you think, Threads and Blue Sky, all of that. But there's this sense in which what's being talked about in academic horror is this idea that we are pursuing knowledge past the limits of where we should go. And I'm thinking even of H.P. Lovecraft, who has all of these kinds of stories about how, oh, if you peel back the veil of reality, you're going to get something really sinister. Or if not sinister, then scary, right? Maybe it doesn't deliberately mean to be sinister, but it is. But you pull back the veil of reality, and there's something underneath that we weren't meant to see. There's a very famous quote at the beginning of The Call of Cthulhu that does this kind of work. The great god Pan, I think, is in part doing this kind of work. If y'all have read the great god Pan, at the very beginning we get a doctor trying to get to this kind of veil of reality. Even something like Stephen King's Revival is doing this kind of work, right? So the academic part of like trying to get to forbidden knowledge is something that I'm interested in, but there's also just this kind of stuffy esoteric aspect of like, what do people not know that is interesting, but not only interesting, is in fact terrifying. And I think there's this like, we have this milieu in social media. The social media ecosystem thrives on conspiracy theories. And there's something here too about like the ancient and the old and those who are holding on to power. So there's all these, kind of culty ideas also in the academy where there's like old people hanging on to power and they're sacrificing young people and that kind of thing. Right? So there's all these ideas. We don't necessarily get to all of those in Suspiria, either 1977 or 2018, but I think that's kind of the landscape that I'm interested in going, and we can kind of figure out how that works and all of the things, the regulation of bodies and ideas, the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, and even the appeal to like ancient power structures, holding on to power and keeping those who are not in power held under that sway or whatever. I think something that we're getting in Suspiria 2018. So Luca Guadagnino makes this remake. We've got these kind of up and coming stars. Chloe Grace Moretz is in it for like a minute. We've got Dakota Johnson. We've got Mia Goth. We've got Tilda Swinton. Right, all these people are incredible, and they're kind of driving the storyline. And the fact that they're all in this together is amazing. But something that we get here is maybe not the idea that we're holding back that which is new, right, under the power of some ancient historical old power structure, but that we've now covered over something ancient that we want like to be revealed again. So I want to talk through this. We talked about that in the first one with Argento Suspiria. What's happening here? Maybe folk horror in the sense of bringing back something ancient, but we have this general idea that what is happening is that there's a desire for a sacrifice of a young dancer. Susie Bannion comes over from the United States and seems like she is going to be subsumed by Helena Marcos. But this is to maintain something ancient. And in the background, there's all this weird political stuff. I want to hear your take on what the RAF is doing, why we're in the German autumn, how that relates to this relationship with the women. But I don't know, Jeff, let's jump in. We haven't done this very often, maybe not ever. This might be the first time that we're returning to a remake, or here I think maybe a reimagining of Suspiria. What do you think is the major differences from Argento Suspiria? And like, what's the similarities? Why is it the same? Why is it different?
Yeah, I mean, lots of good questions there. It's there for being a remake, it's faithful in some ways, but like it does take a lot of turns. We get, like you're saying, this political landscape that the movie is thrust into. The original film, like I think we talked about last episode, you have an Italian director with many Italian actors, it seems, set in Germany, but the film itself is in English. So it's a little confusing at times. But here we have a film that's in German often, so we have subtitles. It's set in Berlin. That's post World War II era, Cold War era. The specter of terrorism from the RAF, as you're saying, it seems like there's some callbacks towards the end of the Holocaust as well. So like there's all of this history of I guess the Nazis and Germany in general, and that political history seems to weigh on what the director's doing with this film in 2018. It's not clear to me exactly how that's connected to witchcraft and the coven that we're dealing with Suspiriorum and the like. But with that, we also get this background for Susie Bannion in this movie that we don't get in the original. Apparently, she grew up Mennonite in a very conservative Mennonite household. So there's a weird connection there, folks. Like Mennonites in Pennsylvania are often referred to as Pennsylvania Dutch, and their language is, and the Amish too, and their language is kind of Germanic. It is a type of, it's more closely related to German than English anyway. Well, I don't know if there's a connection there to be made, or it's just a very conservative, repressive household that Susie Bannion's coming from to then come over here to this dance academy. And like, we're talking about academic horror. So there's one of the tropes. One of the tropes of academic horror can be that it's supposed to be this liberation. The academy, the time of college, it's supposed to be a time when one can find themselves, be free, the social experience of college that Brian, you and I are so often asked to sell when we are talking to our students at good old Penn State Altoona. But I mean, like, I don't understand some of the politics, like what they're doing in this film, other than to acknowledge this is what would have been happening in Germany at that time period. Maybe it wasn't right to just completely gloss over that in the original film. Maybe that's what Guadagnino is doing here by speaking back to it. Klemperer is the only person who is actually actively engaging that because it doesn't seem like the dance academy is. And so maybe that's part of the horror too, like where sometimes a college or an academy or academic horror can be seen as liberating, but maybe also this is the accusation that sometimes academics get of navel gazing, where they're so focused on the subject at hand, so in this case dance, that they're unaware completely of what's going on in the outside world. And that, frankly, seems to be this version of Helena Marcos, played excellently, as you said, by Tilda Swinton. This seems to be a teacher, a woman, a dancer who is really immersed in her craft and what they're doing with the witchcraft as well, but women in the dancing craft in particular. And then, we get French added for reasons, and Susie and Helena talk back and forth in French. So there's that too. We talked about how body horror shows up in the original a little bit in our last episode, but it's like excruciating in this version. In the 2018 version, the body horror is just over the top. Reminded me of times of some of the things we talked about with The Substance. So listeners, if you haven't heard our episode of The Substance, feel free to go back to the backlog and give that a listen. Some good discussions there. And yeah, so I mean, like the politics, Brian, I can see a number of different ways to read that, right? Maybe it's an allegory. Maybe it's not. I have an article to reference later that maybe gets into that. We'll see. Stay tuned. But it seems like, we have to be drawn out of the academy to see these exterior political events. And maybe that is where I'm going to come down on this answer. Like, it is showing us a very clear inside versus outside of what happens in the halls of the dance academy are one thing versus what's going on in the rest of the world is something entirely different. So don't know if anything I said there made any sense to you, but I'd like to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think I read a couple of arguments that I think potentially shine a light on what is happening with the RAF, with the German Autumn, why we're set here. I mean, there's something cute about the fact that Guadagnino sets this movie in 1977, which is, of course, when Argento's original comes out. One thing that so this is an argument from an article called Entanglement in Time by Kaixin Yao. Sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, but it says the character of Dr. Joseph Klemperer is a reference to Victor Klemperer, whose diary becomes an invaluable source that records the witnessing of German society during the Third Reich. And so what we get in this Dr. Joseph Klemperer, who is, I don't know if this is a spoiler or not, folks, played by Tilda Swinton. There's something really interesting about this. Klemperer is the only male figure, as far as I can tell, in the movie, but is played by a woman. And so there's something interesting about that. Is it the case that Guadagnino wanted to have women be the major driving roles? Is that why Swinton is in this role too? I'm not really sure. I'm not sure why that is. But Klemperer ends up being a kind of witness, right? A witness to both what Patricia is doing as part of the RAF. He's reading her diaries. He's trying to psychoanalyze her, etc. But he's also brought in by the company, by the dance studio, to be the witness to the dance that they are performing. And so there's this aspect of it, right? He is seeing, like you're saying, both the inside and the outside at the same time. And so he's our witness to ground us in both what is happening in the dance studio and what's happening outside of the dance studio. The second argument is that there's a worry that the desire to push a new idea out via the RAF, via revolution, maybe even via feminism, or in the dance studio itself, is really just a return of the same. So that this is about violence, it's about control, it's about power, and it's about destruction. It doesn't get us to another place. And maybe it's the case that the RAF is an attempt to highlight that what Helena Marcos is desiring is a return of the same. So she holds sway over the dance company with fear, with rigidity, with the control of their bodies. And it might be the case that once we get the true reveal of Mother Suspiriorum, spoiler alert here, folks, if you haven't seen it, this is a spoiler, is Susie Banyan here, which is a very drastic shift from Argento. But when she is revealed, she maybe tries to do something different. So I think maybe the RAF is like potentially an example of either revolution, but it could be the case that it's a revolution that ultimately brings back the same. One thing that I want to talk about too, and I'll throw this back to you after this question is, right, so we kind of have this image of the witch, and you brought this up last time in our discussion of Argento Suspiria, that most of the time, the image of the witch is really just used men or by patriarchal perspectives to kind of tell the story of how men or patriarchy wants to use witches and women. And there's a clear case, and I've got some articles, and we can go through some of this stuff, but I want to hear your thoughts on this. So there's an argument by Guadagnino himself for why he thinks this is a feminist movie. I want to hear your thoughts about this. So Guadagnino says, well, the movie is about witches, and as we know historically, witches are witches because people decide they are witches. And who are the witches? Usually a group of women that decides to be together, and a certain patriarchal voice doesn't like that. They don't like their independence. I think it was interesting that by making a movie about witches, we were able to summon the power of being a witch and not the indictment of being such, and really separate ourselves from the male gaze. Again, I think Guadagnino here is saying, I made a feminist film because I let witches be witches. Now, there's a whole argument here about, like, again, Guadagnino's doing the work. He's a man, and he is the one who is deciding who is a witch, how they are witches, and how that shows up. I'm going to throw it back to you. Here are your thoughts about Guadagnino's take on this being a feminist film, and whether or not he's right, what kind of pushback there might be.
Yeah, I mean, it's always like, I don't know, tread carefully presenting friends out there if you're going to start making claims about feminism and what feminism is and is not. Like that is dangerous territory to get into, and Guadagnino perhaps should have thought about this before making these comments, because like you're the guy who's writing, directing the film, and you're deciding what feminism is and what feminism isn't. I don't think that's how that works, honestly. But even thinking about how this film differs from the original, I think there's a better argument to be made that the original film is potentially more feminism or better feminism. Again, I'm not going to make any potentially than this movie is, because I mean, what's different in the Coven this time around? There's discord. There are two camps. You have Madame Blanc and then Madame Marcos, Helena Marcos. Like there's the tension between the two, like who's in charge. And so this is women kind of punching down or punching sideways at each other, and then sacrificing the bodies of young women to maintain their power. So I guess if we look at the way the ending works, and listeners, again, spoiler, it's already been spoiled if you've listened this far, but Susie Banyan is Mother Suspiriorum. Maybe that's a feminist message, like the fact that she is the young woman overtaking the old. And then I mean, we'll talk about the end scene, but man, that's rough. That scene, like where she's asking the other dancers, what do you want? And they tell her, and she grants them their wish as if she's like this all-powerful goddess now. Potentially, like there's some empowerment there. The way in which Klemperer is abused and humiliated in the penultimate scene before we get the epilogue, potentially that's a way of looking at some feminist power, and what maybe this is bringing us back to the comparison between the political outside and what's happening on the inside. Maybe feminism is being positioned in a way there as an alternative to patriarchy and all of the evils the patriarchy has brought and wrought upon the world, with things like the Holocaust, with things like, post World War II, Cold War era East Germany. I know we're in Berlin, but right. So that's a constant thing, like you said with the RAF earlier. We do explore same-sex desire again in this version, and I think there's always an interesting interconnection, like the Venn diagram of queer studies and feminism. There's a lot of overlap. Like, you don't get queer studies, you don't get a lot of the political identity category theoretical movements without feminism. So like this film maybe is a testament to that, speaking to like how it helps us think about other identity categories. Like feminism is the way to do that. But I don't, I mean, I don't know. I don't end watching this film, Brian, and say to myself, that's a movie that empowered women in productive ways, because there's an awful lot of violence towards women's bodies throughout this film. And so to say that this is a pro woman, like pro feminist film, to me is a bit of a tetchy claim at best. Like I just don't see it. Like I see witches being witches, and a director like making them witch differently, but I don't see these women deciding how they're going to be witches. Like, this is still the same trope. This is still the same mythos around what witches are and what witches do. Like, if they were uplifting each other and the dance was productive rather than destructive, maybe then. But I don't buy it. For one, I myself here, Jeff Stoynoff, in this moment, do not buy it. Maybe that's something I can pass back to you to ask you, like, what do we do with destruction of women's bodies in this film? What do we do with the body horror? How is this related to academic horror, and probably in some ways in service of academic horror?
I think that's a good question. And to highlight your point, so I read this I thought was a really good article by Lindsay McCummer called Radically Feminist or Monstrously Feminine, which is great. She gives a really clear articulation of what the witch has done historically, and also what the image of or the myth of the goddess has done. And in response to Guadagnino, she's saying, what is a witch? Whatever the men in power says she is. Thus, as Guadagnino suggests, the myth of the witch is a reflection not of the deeds or beliefs of the thousands of women accused of witchcraft, but instead of the fears and anxieties of their persecutors. I think that's really largely what you're getting at, and I appreciate your pushback to say, hold on a second, who are we? We're not going to define feminism here. That's not us. Is this a feminist film? We can be skeptical about it, and I think there's reason to be skeptical about it. And empowerment might be the one, right? Because not only do we get a failed empowerment, right? It doesn't seem to be the case that Marcos is empowering the other women that are there, but she is also sacrificing women for her own sake of her own control of power. There's a hierarchical structure that still, kind of stems from one person. They do vote on who they want, right? Do they want Madame Blanc or do they want Helena Marcos? And so there's this kind of democratic aspect to it, but still, it still seems to remain somewhat hierarchical, or maybe explicitly hierarchical. So I think there's that. I think that scene that you're talking about, this body horror explicitly at the very beginning, where Susie Bannion shows up, and there's a couple of strange things. You read this back after you've watched it, and you say, wait, hold on a second. Susie Bannion is not a trained dancer. That's explicitly stated. She comes to Berlin, which is at the border of East and West Germany. It's at the border of political ideologies, and she shows up and knocks on the door or whatever. She sets up an interview, and she's like, just let me show you how I can dance. I've not been trained, but I'm really good. It's like, okay, how did that happen? Is that just the American like sense of pride in ourselves? We're just like, yeah, we're really good. Do we have evidence for that? We do not. But we're American. Just let us have the microphone, please. All that to say is she seems to have some kind of supernatural, or just, I don't know, just this kind of talent. And so she takes over the lead for this dance that they've been practicing for so long, just over and over again. We talk about the rigors and the regulation of bodies. I imagine that these dancers have been going through the same motions over and over and over again, trying to get it right. And she just goes, I can do it. Let me do it. And so she stands in, and we get this scene where she's taking over the person that just quit, who, on her way out, calls them witches, not in German, but in Russian, right? Potentially separating herself from the political kind of structure of the day. But of course, Russia is a major part of East West Germany after World War II. So I don't know. There's lots of complex politics there. All that to say is, like, I think that scene right there shows us something because once one person is replaced, the other person is sacrificed. It's not as if that woman was like, you don't like what we're doing. We understand. We have our differences. Let's make sure that you can pursue your own sense of goodness. It's like, no, we are going to violently and destructively destroy your body. Yeah, I don't know. There's something about that. I don't really know what to do with that sense of violence other than to say, like, again, the RAF on the outside is perpetuating this regime of fear. They're a far left terrorist organization, seemingly, right? If you have a better grasp of that history than I do, please let me know. But there's that sense in which, oh, what we're doing is we're just replacing a regime of terror with another regime of terror, a regime of control with another regime of control. I think there's something potentially interesting because the weird there's at least three different power structures going on here. We've got Helena Marcos, who's like this the ancient thing, who seems to be claiming that she's Mother Superiorum. We've got Madame Blanc, who maybe you've got a better French than I do, is like White Mother. Is that Madame Blanc? Something like that? Which it's not mentioned here, but in Argento's Suspiria, we get the idea that Helena Marcos is the Black Queen. So we have the Black Queen. That's a clear hierarchical structure, monarchy. We get Mother White. That's a different kind of structure. It's a family structure. The mother is the caring mother, right? Rather than the kind of controlling, dominating monarchy or something. And then we have the revelation of the true Mother Superiorum and in Susie Banyan, right? And so what does she bring? It's unclear, her ideology. The one picture we get is when she goes back to Klemper at the very end and like kind of reveals to him what happened to his wife, who's played by the same woman that plays Susie Banyan in Argento's. Again, very cute. I don't know if there's something more to that. All that to say is, right, we get these three power structures. And so, Jeff, you're cueing me into that Madam is not mother. It's more like, or yeah, I don't know, Mrs. or something like that. I mean, it's the head of the dance school. All that to say, it does, maybe that's the question. Is this highlighting different ways of structuring power? Is that part of what this kind of, the three versions of what we get? Of course, on the outside, not only do we get the RAF, but we also get the intrusion of the dance studio by the police officers. And I think these are the only men cast in the movie. They're police officers, and they end up being kind of ridiculed by the people in the dance studio, especially the kind of elders of the dance studio. I don't know, the members of the Witches Coven. So anyways, thoughts on the power structure going on in Suspiria, thoughts on what's happening with those three factions, if that gives us insight to what maybe Guadagnino's doing, or I don't know, anything else that you wanted to talk about in terms of Suspiria.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power structure question's interesting. I was thinking while you were talking through Susie Banyan arriving as an American with no formal training in dance, and she's just, a prodigy. And then Madam Helen Marcos, she begins kind of like grooming Susie Banyan. And this is like interestingly for a movie that Guadagnino says is feminist, that we sort of maybe discovered some holes in that argument. There's also potentially a little bit of like homophobia going on here with the same-sex desire, because like what's the things that anytime you have a teacher or an instructor or anyone who is, or a mentor, like who is homosexual, bisexual, whatever, and there's a youth involved of the same sex that they're maybe, they're interested in, there's the accusations of grooming. But like here in this case, they are legitimate. Like it is very clear that she's using her power to groom Susie Banyan. The irony is that, as you mentioned, and we've talked about, Mother Susie Banyan is Mother Superiorum. So really, she's the one that has the power. But there's like that these power structures you're talking about. You see it too in those flashbacks to her house when she's in the United States, when she is in that Mennonite community. Like there's power structures there where she doesn't have power in that setting. We witness these scenes, I think, where it's her mother who's like slowly dying. That and her father is just like, not no one's allowed to do anything. No one's allowed to intervene. It's God's will, whatever. So you have that power structure involved. Just like the general political power structures that you're talking about. I mean, I think Berlin is a fitting space for this because it's literally on the liminal. It's liminal. It's on the in between. You have it. It's half, like you said, part of East Germany. It's part West Germany. This is the wall that Ronald Reagan so famously went over and knocked down himself with jelly beans, one at a time. Like this, all of these power structures speak to academic horror and the way in which we see these types of texts really probe like what's going on in the hallways of academia, what's going on in these institutions, what type of horror is it? And in some ways it's psychological because the character in the movie, the book, whatever, is having to come to terms with, is what I'm seeing real? Is what I'm being told accurate? Like, how do I discern what reality from fiction? And I think we see that more, if more subtly and understated. There's more of that Dario Argento's version of the film. This one is more focused on Susie Banyan. The 2018 Luca Guadagnino is focused on Susie Banyan. It's focused on these power structures, but it's not really focused on probing them as much as just pointing them out. And I want to bring in an article that I read to talk about like how this could work as allegory. I'm not sure how much I believe of this, but just gonna read it here. This is John W. Roberts, Dancing the Dance of Another, Allegory, the Diagram, and Suspiria from 2023. So, Roberts writes, before assuming the mantle of Mother Suspiriorum, if we take Susie for having been a novitiate at the film's beginning rather than a master in disguise, which is a question, that was an aside, Susie mistakes the coven for nothing more than a dance company, although ultimately the coven's leadership disastrously mistakes Susie in the end for nothing more than a dancer. To the central narrative irony, we can add the film's play of comparisons between dance, witchcraft, and the radical terrorist politics of the RAF. Actor Tilda Swinton's triple performance as Blanc, Klemperer, and Marcos, and the various ways that Guadagnino's film displaces narrative and stylistic elements of Dario Argento's original, a set of displacements that led some critics to claim that the film had indeed misrecognized what was significant about Argento's film. First, Berlin for Freiburg, drab colors for garish ones, Tom York for Goblin, and a mournful rumination on the Holocaust for a fairy tale. Across the board, the inability to look beneath the surface of the skin, of a building, of a name, and read the depths of identity, structure, and form proves disastrous. Going to end the quote there. And so, while I'm maybe apprehensive of where Roberts takes this argument throughout the course of his article, I do think this is what I was just saying and what we've talked about, where this movie does touch on certain things. But interestingly, for using body horrors as much as it doesn't go beyond the skin. It does not go beyond skin deep or surface depth at times. Like it presents all these possibilities for us to think about as viewers, and that's wonderful. Like adding some of these elements, like the reflection on the RAF or the Holocaust, or why are we in Berlin rather than Freiburg? Why have we gone from a film that is notorious, like it is a classic horror film, Argento's original, for the crazy colors and the crazy music? Why have we opted for this instead? And so it is a film that leaves you thinking about these power structures, maybe without commenting on them in any way other than, hey, I'm going to say this is a feminist argument and women are empowering women because Susie Banyan is Mother Superiorum after all, and gets to chart her own path rather than being groomed, rather than just being used as fuel for the actual, the heads of the coven at the school, rather than become just another Mennonite woman in the United States of America who has little standing, little rights in a very patriarchal society, rather than just becoming a background dancer. Like she is the lead dancer with all the fun dancing of the Vogue. So, without jumping into the Jameson and Deleuze stuff of that article, which we're not going to do, listeners, not today. Nope, nope, nope. I guess I want to turn it back to you, Brian, for what other elements do we have left to discuss?
Yeah, I like all of what you're saying, and I think that the relationship between Madame Blanc and Susie Bannion is complex and interesting, and I think it's one that requires some problematization. I'm curious about the relationship, also the tensions that are clear with Mia Goth's character. Mia Goth plays who? Who does Mia Goth play? Sarah. And Sarah, and we get the friend, right, in Suspiria 1977. We get the friend in Argento Suspiria. But Sarah seems a little bit closer, seems to invite Susie in to the dance studio a little bit more significantly. And there seems to be an intimacy there as well. I'm not sure there's anything to say about that, but I think there's a kind of curiosity about what is happening with Sarah's character, why she's there, what she does, and how she drives the plot. I do think you're right that like, yeah, we get this very expressionist kind of film with Dario Argento. There's really not a lot of plot. It's not clear that we have a robust mythology related to witchcraft and the coven. I think we get a little bit more of that in this more recent one in Guadagnino's version. In that sense, like I think this ends up being a reimagining of the movie rather than a remake of the movie, right? Guadagnino, and probably for good reason, is not trying to do that. I think there's something shocking about that very last scene, about the dance that happens. Where are they? A basement dungeon or sacrifice room? I have no idea, right? But they're down there and they're dancing, and the reds become very, they contrast very clearly with all the drab kind of colors and the muted tones of the rest of the film. And that makes sense, right? In terms of the Berlin at that time, I don't know. I wasn't there, but I imagine that that's fairly close to what is happening. The one thing, I know we talked about feminism, we've talked about all these kinds of things before. I do want to point out that Madame Blanc at least has said that she has kept this dance studio open through World War II, and she was the one that kind of kept it open for women to find a place that is outside of the typical family structure. So if it's the case that it's not just about making babies and being a person that is able to birth humans, this is about trying to find some higher purpose or calling that would allow you to fulfill, I don't know, a higher value or higher function. That's, it feels even weird to say, call it a higher one, but different from the structure. And that's where Susie, coming from the Mennonite colony or whatever, makes a lot of sense. She's escaping that similar kind of structure where she is probably, meant to be on a certain path. And of course, we get these kind of dream scenarios where we see that she's been punished for maybe sexual desire or other kinds of things in that community. And so there is a sense in which what Madame Blanc has offered is the opportunity to pursue one's self and one's goals. Like you were saying, this is academic horror, very much so. Pursue who you are, but when you dig deep and realize that, okay, who you are is always going to be determined by somebody who runs the show. It's not the case that you're actually finding yourself, right? Always apologies bringing in Aristotle here, but right, Aristotle's going to claim that what we need is habituation to become good people, but that's ultimately the goal of the state to implement, right, and the virtuous group of people that to implement habits that would allow you to pursue being a good person. But the habits themselves are determined by the state or determined by a group of people that seem to be virtuous. And so you are always habituated, right? The grooming question, is it the case? And I want to be careful here. Education is not always grooming in the way that we think about it in the like clear sexual predatory overtones, but in habituation, in the narrative. And we're getting this too with Guadagnino. If education is always about trying to articulate the freedom of expression, the freedom of the ability to find your ideas and who you are within what is thinkable, it's always just allowing you the space in which to do that. And that's been determined by somebody else. And Guadagnino is saying, oh, I'm going to make this thing, this feminist film, but I'm going to tell you who they are, how they are, what they're going to do, and I'm going to give you their resolution. So, I mean, in part, I want to say, like, okay, Guadagnino maybe this wasn't accomplished as you wanted it to be. But also, like in education, the task of both the teacher and the student is to try to push the student to a place where they have to accept what's been in the past. They are within a structure of what's available to them and could potentially push forward into something new. I don't know. I feel like I'm like maybe I'm reaching here. So Jeff, pull us back in with the film, and if you want to try to find some joy, if that's where we want to go, let's do it. But pull us back, ground us. Maybe we've leaped too high. Isn't that part of the movie? The leaps that Susie Bannion has to make. She has to get higher, and she wants to know what draws us back and anchors us to the soil, to the earth, to the ground, etc.
I mean, those jumps are something. And when you're watching it, like the close up on the ankles, I was just waiting for her ankle to break. And I know she's a dancer, and so it's not going to happen. However, just the way the cinematography was done, it does give you the specter of fear that something is going to happen. And the way that we've seen bodies broken in the movie already at that point, excuse me, you definitely could imagine it's a real possibility. I don't think you're taking us too far away from it. I mean, I think these are all questions of academic horror. What's it do? You have to think through it. You have to understand what's going on. While you were talking, I was strangely reminded of our conversation about Immaculate way back over a year ago, and thinking then how are witches like nuns, and how are nuns like witches, and how are these female communities always somehow suspected? Their ways of knowing things differ from the rest of the world's way of knowing things, and of course, what you said about grooming, like there is something about habituation, where when people are learning how to think and learning how to becoming professional in their learning, whether it's a more like humanities based curriculum or a more like business or vocational based curriculum, there's habituation's part of it. And so like, yeah, there is grooming to an extent there too. You're absolutely right. I do think maybe we should turn to talking about some joy in the movie. For me, like the number one joy of this film is Tom York's soundtrack. I think it is an 11 out of 10. The Goblin soundtrack for the original Dario Argento 1977 one is good, and it does really add to the flavor, the mystery of the film for sure. It gives you fear in the way that the Jaws music does. That we talked about this last episode. But this Tom York soundtrack is A, I love Radiohead, so I am the audience for this. But B, it speaks so well. The haunting sort of melancholy voice of Tom York does a really nice job of encapsulating the mood of this film. This film is it's very moody in that way. Like it does get scary at the end. Things kind of fall apart. There's always what did you call it? The sacrifice room or the something room. It was a great phrase, whatever it was you said. So like A plus on that. But yeah, all of these buildings in these horror films have that room that's just like the sacrifice room or the killing room. And so, like it's just yeah. And there's that great scene at the end where like there's Madame Blanc who finds Helena Marcos, who's like kind of still half alive, but also her head's like been mostly severed. That's not joyful. Sorry, that's gross. But like the fact that there's always this killing room going on. Mia Goth, man, is so weird. Like she's just so weird in everything she's in. I guess I find a weird sense of joy in Mia Goth, just Mia Gothing in this movie. Probably one of her earlier roles, like you mentioned earlier, but she's establishing that she is just this very weird, eccentric actress who is going to do a role the way she wants to. The content, the end of the what happens at the end and the ending scene is one of the more bizarre scenes in a film I've ever seen, with the dancing going on like just manically, really, and people are like falling over because their bodies are just literally giving out on them as they're doing this dance as part of this ritual. But it combines like a lot of motifs that we've talked about in things like Midsummer. It reminds me in some ways, some of the makeup and the special effects remind me of David Lynch's version of Dune back from the 80s. Like there's just some prosthetics and stuff going on here that are very strange. So, I mean, yeah, I'm going to say my key joy is the Tom York soundtrack. And of course, talking through these issues. That's always my fallback in figuring out what to do with this shit. Brian, what joy did you find?
Yeah, there's a lot of me that's like, I like this movie. And there's a lot of me that was like, I don't like this movie. So I think, if there's something about art that requires us to do a couple of things. Number one, take stock of our emotion or affective response to a thing. It was successful. I have to navigate my own appreciation, like, dislike of the movie. And there's something joyful about that, about the work. Again, this conversation that we're doing is in some way motivated, required by the artistic piece itself. Whether or not it was successful in all its ideas, etc., maybe that doesn't matter. It was a kind of artistic expression and object for us to dig deep into. And there's a lot here to kind of dig into. I'm going to get some hate for this, I know, but I don't like Radiohead. I've tried so hard. I know. I know. I see your face, Jeff. I see it. I'm starting to like them a little bit more. Here's the thing, people have tried to convince me to like Radiohead for so long that I used to get multiple mix CDs. People would burn CDs of their favorite Radiohead songs. And I have OK Computer, and I have two or three of their albums, and I listen to them sometimes, and I try. But there's a quote by one of the brothers from Oasis that's like, I don't know about Tom York. It just sounds like he's not having fun playing music. It sounds like he hates his audience, and he wants them to hate his music just as much as he hates making it. And there's part of me that's like, okay, Tom York, I think you need to have a little bit more fun. I will say, I agree with you. The soundtrack works here. The soundtrack is helpful for producing the atmosphere of the film. I think in a similar way that Goblin's soundtrack does for Argento's. So yes, I'm sorry. I think I'm starting to like Radiohead more 30 years down the line or whatever, 20 years down the line after people were really like, you got to listen to Radiohead, but they're not high on the list for me. I will say that I found joy in the choreography of the dance. Again, I'm not a dancer. I'm not a sophisticated audience member for dance generally, but there's something about choreographing movement alongside the choreography of editing that I think is impressive in the film. And people have talked about this, but I will jump on and say that I agree that the disturbing scene where Susie takes over the lead role and we get the previous woman now discarded into that mirrored room. She can't see, right? Well, I don't know. At one point she couldn't see, and she's like just kind of ushered into this room, and she's thrown against the walls, and the mirrors are there to kind of highlight all of the kind of ways in which her body is being destroyed. The destruction of her body itself, that's not the joyful part. But there's something about the choreography of dance and the choreography of editing that I think is impressive. And there's something joyful about that. Again, it produces a response in a way that I think is not just about the broken bodies. When I think about torture porn or I think about these other kinds of horrors, that it's just about the disgust in relation to the body. I think there's more that's going on here. And for that, I think I find some joy in that sense of bodily movement, bodily destruction. And again, I'm not a dancer. And I'm not sophisticated in terms of understanding it. But with any kind of high athletic performance, there's an inherent destruction of one's body as part of it. Football players, basketball players, soccer players, dancers. I think that there's a call to the violence that one does to one's body for the sake of something else. And again, there's this kind of circular call to the art itself and what it's doing and requiring us to respond to it. And I think, again, that's the joy of us doing this conversation and having this conversation here is in response to that. And so that's incredibly joyful. All right, Jeff, I think we're close to the end here, but I want to know final thoughts. We did not talk about the fact that, I mean, at least not very much, about Tilda Swinton doing 3 roles. Not sure what else, what to say about that, why she's in those 3 roles, what that's about. But if you have final thoughts, what do you got?
Yeah, I mean, it's a much like you, I don't know whether I actually like this movie or not. It's very weird. It's an experience to see. I think is worth watching. I don't I don't know if I'd want to watch it again though. Like maybe I would. I don't know. It's a very strange movie. It's very weird. It definitely is academic horror, and it does some of the hallmark things that academic horror should do. So I guess for us, it's a success. It's made me think about the movie The Witches from 1990. I kind of want to go back and watch that now. But yeah, overall, like this is an interesting, I think I like the way you said, not necessarily a remake, but a reimagining of Argento's 1977 original. It's on Prime for free. So if you too are giving Jeff Bezos all of your money, go and watch it, and he'll make you watch ads now as well because that's just, the hellscape we live in. That's really all I have, Brian, to say about it. Anything else you'd like to add, or are we good to say over and out?
I think that might be it. I think one of the things that the petty things, right? There's so much in this world that is terrible and ongoing. And I think, all of the kind of shit that's happening in the world right now that's awful, that's obviously way above this. But one of the petty things that I really hate about our world right now is that every time you pause a show on a streaming platform, it's now going to show you an ad because they have to give you ads every single second that they possibly can. And I hate that, right? This is why I have decided to start a slow building of my DVD catalog. I
Yeah.
did not ever get rid of my physical media. I've got loads of DVDs still. I got a DVD player for Christmas, and I'm excited to like slowly build that up, going to yard sales and whatever, because I know that there's problems with DVDs too, but I just want to get away from the ads, and I think that this is one way of unshackling myself from the streamers. All that to say, Jeff, I think we've done it. I think we've gotten through both Suspirias, and hopefully we've added something to the conversation. Not only something to the conversation in terms of the ideas, but also in terms of joy. And for that, I'm grateful for these conversations, and I'll leave us there. Folks, find joy even in horror. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.